Right. Hello, everyone. I am Nathaniel Trepke, author of my upcoming fantasy novel, The Dawn of Darkness. It is my debut novel, and I wanted to go all in terms of quality, so I contacted a professional narrator to make an audiobook. And I must say, after listening to it, I am thoroughly impressed. And today I have the pleasure of interviewing the narrator who made it all possible, Dallin Bradford. Welcome to the official Dawn of Darkness audiobook interview.
Thanks. I'm very excited. It was a pleasure to narrate.
All right, glad to hear. So, why don't you start by telling us about your background and narrating experience?
I've been a full-time narrator for about 5 years, a little over 5 years now. And I started narrating as soon as I wrapped up my acting school. I went and studied in Ireland, just a little intensive program. There were 15 students all told, and we met at the Teachers Club in Parnell Square in Dublin. And So I got my acting training there. To save up for said training, I worked in a call center after I graduated high school. And so every third day or so, someone would say something about my deep voice. So then I got into maybe thinking I could do voiceover. I also grew up listening to my parents narrating to us. We would have like Saturday readathons where my dad would sit in a chair in the living room. We would lay out a spread in the dining room, and then we would just listen to him read for like 4 hours. And he would read full fantasy series, a bunch of Sanderson, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Fablehaven, all the good YA stuff. Um, and then I got into theater when I was in junior high, and that kind of just stuck. And so then I came back to after Ireland, I came back to the States, and I started working for a publishing house in Springville, Utah, and I became their audiobook producer. So I was not just narrating books myself, but I was also directing and producing audiobooks for with other narrators for that publishing house. And then things have just kind of expanded from there. And so now I'm just kind of do it with clients, lots of indie authors like yourself. And then I also do work with big publishing houses now, and it's all just kind of grown organically as time has gone on. So I think I've done over 120 audiobooks now. Um, and
Impressive.
Well, it sounds impressive until you hear about other narrators who have, like Scott Brick, who narrated Scott Brick and Simon Vance, who were involved with the Dune series back when it was first turned into an audiobook. And each of them have done over 1,000 across their careers. And so I have rookie numbers. It sounds really impressive, but I have a long way to go.
Well, I must say, when I was listening to the audio that you gave me, I did not think you had rookie numbers. I thought you were up there with the other ones,
Uh-huh.
just in terms of quality.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I feel like you don't have to have done lots and lots and lots and lots. It's not just a numbers game. You can get good fast too. Um, but uh, but yeah, so like there are some excellent narrators. Like one of my favorites that I've listened to recently is The Gentleman in Moscow. And that narrator has not done 1,000 audiobooks, but he's excellent. So their numbers is not the only thing that indicates a quality narrator.
Well, it's pretty obvious now that I know, right? Anyway, so do you have a process for getting into the book and narrating it with the top quality that you provide?
Yeah, so typically it starts with communicating with the author. I usually like to ask for the author's idea of character descriptions because I can always pull them from the book as I'm doing my analysis prior to recording. But I like to make sure that the author shares their vision with me so that it can be a little more collaborative. Um, so your very thorough background work, laying out a map of everything and the different dialects that would be used for given areas, and then character personalities and that kind of stuff, kind of how you saw them. Um, that was extremely helpful. So then, once I've gotten author's initial inputs, then I will then I'll usually analyze the book kind of chapter by chapter. Um, and I will make sure that I have a good understanding of the whole story. I start recording, and usually that starts with some samples for approval before I commit to my choices. So I sent off character samples and a chunk of narrative. Usually it's like 10, 15 minutes of just some chapter, and then usually character voices of the core cast. There are some characters that are small enough in a lot of big cast books that I don't worry about getting them approved because it's not a huge deal to go back and redo them if the author doesn't like what I've done. Um, and then once the samples are approved, then I jump into it and I start recording. And then after that, it's just chapter by chapter by chapter, just and I like to send them off to authors. Some narrators will, once getting the samples approved, they'll just do the whole thing and send it off. Um, but I prefer to get feedback because it allows the author to kind of have more of a sense of control over the piece. And since the author is the one that I am ultimately responsible to, those your opinion matters. Right?
Yes.
Um, and uh, and then it also allows me to catch anything that would be some kind of a technical error early on. So sometimes a name is pronounced differently. And if that isn't caught in the initial analysis and I commit to something, then that can be a lot of hassle
Oh,
to
yeah,
to
lots
go
of
through
editing.
and pick up. Hmm. Yeah. So then, in addition to that, when I initially send off chapters for performance review, I have not yet tweaked the audio too much. I basically just boost it to be listenable and then take out my mistakes as I proof it once. Um, and I actually my wife is my editor, engineer, proofer extraordinaire. And so I usually send the chapters up to her, and then she will proof it and then send me a list of the things that she's caught. And then I'll take care of those. And then we send it off for performance review. Um, and then once performances are approved, then we'll master the audio and get it all up to snuff, technically speaking. Balancing levels, making sure that louds aren't too loud, softs aren't too soft, there aren't too many annoying mouth noises or really long pauses or distracting breaths or that kind of thing. Um, and then once that's done, then we send it off and it's ready for distribution.
All right. And just a quick question, how many attempts does it usually take for you to get through a chapter with the quality that you're happy with?
Well, I don't really take chapters one at a I don't really take chapters as a whole. Instead, I usually am breaking it down. And so if I don't like how I did a sentence or if I don't like how I've read a scene, then I can go back and just do that chunk. Um, but uh but I'm also a pretty good cold reader. And so cold reading is where you can read something kind of on your first or second try and it sounds pretty good. And so I'm often pretty satisfied with my first or second take. There are some phrases though, or some scenes, or some like specific lines. I'm like, nah, that's not quite right. And so there are two different ways that I'll approach mistakes that I've messed around with. And there are some very strong opinions in the audiobook narration world around how you should handle retakes when you're doing multiple, when you're not happy with your performance, or if you stutter or you mispronounce something. One of them is called punch and roll, and that's kind of the current king. And that's where you pause the recording and then you delete the mistake and then you play a little bit of the audio right before you made the mistake so that you can kind of hear what you sounded like right up to that point that you wanted to change. And then the software will just keep going and it will start recording once it reaches the end of the audio. And so then you get to redo that line and it just kind of is continuous. Then there's another technique, which is honestly what I prefer. And I've seen narrators like I've seen Scott Brick, one of the guys who's done 1,000. He uses a clicker, um, and that's what this little is. It's a dog clicker, and so I will frequently use this, and I'll just if I stutter, like the red fox jumped over the brown log, and what that does is it creates this visual spike in the waveform because it's a high-pitched, really loud click. And so then visually, I can see where I've made a mistake. Um, and so sometimes I'll do that. Sometimes I'll do punch and roll. It kind of depends on the project, but I tend to prefer using a clicker. And and then sometimes, very rarely, I'll actually just note that I've done 3 takes of a scene or something. And then I'll tell the author, hey, at about 6 minutes in this chapter, I did a few takes. Let me know which one you want me to keep, or if you hate all of them, and I'll just redo it again. So it kind of varies project by project, character by character.
All right, that's very interesting. I've done like a tiny bit of audio stuff myself because I'm learning to be a programmer in school. And so one of my interests is
Hmm.
game development. And for games, you need sounds, of course. So I've looked at kind of what the sound files look like. So I instantly knew what you meant when you used the high frequency dog clicker thing to see
Uh-huh.
the spike. I instantly knew what you meant. That's kind of cool
Yeah,
to
yeah.
hear that. So anyway, I was particularly impressed by your accents when you were reading my story. How do you do that? How do you have so many accents and do it, consistently throughout the story?
Yeah, well, that can be one of the things that I go back and redo a few times, right? So in this book, for example, there was a Dutch character, and I've never been called on to do a Dutch accent before. And so I had to learn how to do a Dutch accent. And, my first take, which I kind of just treated like a placeholder until I had time to learn how to do a better Dutch accent, um, was not that great, right? It was fine, but not too great. And then once I had figured out, it took a long time to find good Dutch samples. So there are a couple of resources that I'll go to. So there's a place called I think it's dialectsarchive.com or something like that. It's the IDEA, or the International Dialects of English Archive, and it has just thousands of samples of people from all over the world speaking English. And so, like, they have 9 different Iranian samples of people from Iran who are speaking in English. And then they have, dozens of British accents, or accents in the UK. And then they also have dozens of Irish accents, and then, countless scores of different American accents. And so that's frequently a resource that I'll use. Sometimes I will also pull in a dialect coach. So I know a couple of people who just teach accents and dialects full time, and so sometimes I'll use those people as a resource. So like, for example, it was probably back towards the beginning of my career. Um, I was in a play that called on a very refined kind of posh RP accent, or received pronunciation. And that's this kind of an accent, the kind that you see in all the BBC dramas. And that accent was something that I learned from a dialect coach. Um, for a play called Charlie's Aunt. It was this comedic farce about some college guys who need a chaperone in order to date the girls they want to date, because this is back in the days where you needed a chaperone. And so they dress up one of their other college buddies as an old woman and then have her be their chaperone. And so we needed to learn how to do fancy, refined British dialects. Um, and so sometimes it's a dialect coach. Sometimes I'm just listening to samples. And then there's something that's kind of in between. There's a website that I discovered just like last year called accenthelp.com. And they sell kind of accent lesson packages, kind of like online courses of accents. And they have, I think, something like 40 different packets um, of kind of clusters, geographic clusters. And then within those, there will be, 6 to 10 hours of course materials. A lot of it is just samples of native speakers, like the Dialects of English Archive. And then some of it is direct teaching, like telling you how to shape your vowels in a certain way, in the pace and like the lilt of an accent. And so that kind of thing um, it's kind of like in between just listening to samples and a full-on dialect coach.
Okay, that's pretty cool. You have a lot of resources to draw on there. I'm almost tempted to listen to this language archive and just poke around myself, see
Yeah,
what
go for it.
what
I can
devices
send you
down
the
there.
link.
So, on that note, were there any characters in the Dawn of Darkness that you particularly enjoyed voicing?
Yeah, so I really enjoyed the the character Lance. Sorry, I was pulling up the link and I'll just do it later. So Lance was really fun. My initial impression of him, we did not give him a Yorkshire accent, but then I kind of just went out on a limb, and gave him kind of a North Country accent, and uh, and I think it worked pretty well for his character.
I certainly
And then
enjoyed it.
and as we tweaked him to make him sound a little younger than I made him, that character just became loads of fun to play. And also the love triangle that happens in his story, in his arc, is just really fun to narrate. It's a fun tension that that is kind of also a nice it's a nice tangent. It's a departure from kind of the more serious, we got to save the world kind of narrative from the rest of the book. It's very fun. And so his storyline is just this great it's just this great character that you've written, and he's loads of fun.
I'm glad you like it. I certainly enjoy writing him. I'm glad you enjoyed reading him. So, kind of on the opposite note now, did you face any major challenges when narrating the story?
Um, yeah, so there were a couple of times where characters might be a little tricky to differentiate. So, for example, Emma and Daisy, again in Lance's plot, the two girls in the love triangle, um, I I gave them voices that I thought were pretty distinct from one another, and then I had to kind of tweak them a little bit more just to make sure that they were unique to each other. And so there were several retakes as I was doing their lines because also their accents are similar, and so I'd find myself slipping into the West Country accent, and then I would slip into Daisy's accent when I was doing Emma. And so, because all three of them have very similar kind of country accents, but I wanted to make sure that they were distinct from each other, and so it was that was a bit of a mess, a kind of a tangle for me. And then there was also the Dutch accent that I already mentioned, where I had to go and learn a Dutch accent. Um, and then aside from that, I don't know that I would say other bits were challenging. But but it was certainly like this. It was engaging to do all of these action scenes where you have to change how you are doing the narrative. Um, because you need to give some kind of a perspective as the narrative voice. You can't just be like the eyeball of God looking on without any opinions, kind of a thing. And so like tweaking the way that the story, the narrative was read, um, to fit the tone of the scenes was really fun because you have these great dynamics, and like there are sometimes really drastic shifts, right? So there are some bits that read like a horror story. There are some bits that read like a light romance. There are some bits that read like an action adventure. There are some bits that feel like a kind of more historical fiction. And so the story has all these different flavors and notes to it, and so needing to adjust the narrative voice throughout the story to make it appropriate for the scene was, I don't know if I would quite call it a challenge, but it was certainly this really good kind of something that I had to rise to the occasion for.
Yeah, well, you definitely rose to the occasion. I was very impressed with how you handled it. That's why I didn't have many comments whenever you asked me for input because I thought you just did a good job right off the bat. All right, so we're starting to run out of time here. So before we close off, do you have any last comments on The Dawn of Darkness?
Everyone should read it or listen to it. It reads really nicely, speaking as someone who has read through it. And it also, I think, it probably sounds pretty good if you're listening to the audiobook.
I would agree.
Yeah, it's a really good one. And I hope that you keep writing, and that this story just keeps going.
No,
It
I
feels like
definitely
the
will.
beginning of this epic arc. It reminded me a lot of the setup that Joe Abercrombie had for his I think it's the First Law trilogy. Are you familiar with
Well,
Joe
I've heard,
Abercrombie?
I've definitely heard of that.
Yeah, yeah. So the first book, I actually just finished re-listening to it. Um, and that has a similar kind of epic scale and a similar kind of setup where you feel like you've gotten a taste of what's out there in the world, and now I want you to write more so that we can have more of it.
Oh yeah, there will definitely be more coming
Good.
soon, hopefully. All right. Well, thank you very much for meeting me, Dallin. And again, thank you for narrating the book. I'm looking
Yeah,
forward to seeing how the audience receives it. It'll be coming out in July at the moment. Early July is the plan. So that'll be
great.
available very soon, and everybody can experience your wonderful narration. Thank you
That's
very
exciting.
much.
Yeah, and thank you.